Now that we know how the government of Canada and Ontario and Toronto affect businesses, we want to maybe consider whether they should and what is the appropriate level of intervention. So we saw that there are issues like workplace safety, uh, the health and safety in restaurants, permits, consumer protection, food safety alerts. Um, those are all reasons that the government protects Canadians by getting involved. There are some cases where it's not clear cut whether the government should intervene or not, and one of which is the example of a minimum wage. Uh, some feel that it's important for the government to set a standard because otherwise businesses will establish the lowest possible wage possible. Others feel that it reduces employment, that if there's a high minimum wage, it discourages businesses from hiring people. So let's look at both sides of the issue, looking at how it's been handled in Ontario lately and how it affects workers in Ontario and Toronto. So, why would governments create a minimum wage? Uh, well, it is to ensure that all workers have a certain lifestyle, at least a certain standard of living, to that no one's forced to work endlessly in order to make ends meet. So a minimum wage is established, um, and then the question is, well, how should it change over time? What is that right level? So right now, 9% of Ontario workers are paid the minimum wage. So it's about 1 in 10 workers in Ontario are affected by this. And here's a little chart to show how it's changed over the years. So initially it was under $5, like $3 an hour. And gradually increased because with inflation, goods cost more, so it's necessary to pay workers more so they can have the same purchasing power. Under the Kathleen Wynne Liberal government, they boosted the minimum wage to $14 an hour, and they were going to make it $15 an hour. So why would they do that? Well, it pays workers a living wage. It distributes profits more evenly, so it's not simply those who own capital or those who own business who are enriching themselves. That if there's a good minimum wage, it will reduce inequality. Uh, the idea is that society should assist all community members, not just some, and to keep up with inflation because as there's more and more people living in Toronto, Ontario, and Canada, demand for goods continues to rise, so the price level keeps rising. So if prices are rising and if costs for apartments and gas and other necessities are rising, then the minimum wage should rise along with it. Well, why would people be opposed? Well, because they argue it leads to fewer jobs, that there's only so much money set aside for hiring people, and if the minimum wage is too high, companies will just choose to hire less and divide the work among the existing employees. They argue that it will result in higher prices, that the company's expenses will be passed on to the consumers in the form of a higher price. Um, some might say that the government should not interfere in small business, that there's enough red tape as it is, there's enough regulation, there's enough rules, so by specifying a high minimum wage, um, that's just more interference. And in fact, some might say, well, when the minimum wage goes up, it contributes to inflation. And also that uh, when there are cheap jobs, that's entry level jobs for students and for part time workers. So um, those are some things you might want to consider. Uh, I think we said that 10% of workers are working for minimum wage, so that may refute the point that it is a significant contributor to inflation. And I think the idea of entry level jobs, that when companies create internships to get people to work for free as part of an entry-level job, and argue that it's part of an educational experience, they, sometimes they enter this ethical gray area, even if there's no minimum wage. Those would be some of the sides of both parties, and you'd want to think about it and make up your own mind. So, who exactly is working for a minimum wage in Toronto? It tends to be those with education, those who are younger, and it tends to be women. So, you can see the percentage of people working for the minimum wage. Produced by Statistics Canada. They do a labor force survey just to get a thumbnail of what the working population in Canada is facing and what conditions are prevailing throughout the economy. So you can see that women, more of them work for the minimum wage, and definitely more younger workers work for the minimum wage. And it's especially, if you did not go to get a high school, or you did not complete your post-secondary degree, there's a higher chance you'll be working for the minimum wage. And what type of jobs are these? Well, these tend to be retail jobs. They tend to be jobs facing customers in fast food restaurants. You can see the biggest change: Yum, McDonald's, Subway, Burger King. They're all in here. Starbucks. Big chain department stores like Walmart and Target. It's probably going to be in customer service, perhaps in retail, or perhaps in the food service business. And situations in Canada would be similar. So if you think about, well, how does those types of hours work? Well, you tend not to be have a regular 9 to 5 shift. The hours can vary. Some weeks you might get more hours than others. Your shifts can change on short notice. So in addition to having the low wages, these types of workers also face very precarious employment conditions, because they're not exactly sure what's going to happen from one week to another, and it may lead them to have more than one job. So the Ford government, when initially elected in 2018, decided to roll back the minimum wage increase back to $14, and it currently sits at $14.25.
Not a very pretty picture for minimum wage workers. The Ford government here at Queen's Park today said it's freezing the minimum wage for 2 years, and then it's only going to go up with inflation.
As of October 2020, annual increases to minimum wage will be based on an economically sound metric: inflation.
Last year, the annual inflation rate was up just 1.6%, which would have meant just a 22-cent increase to the $14 minimum wage.
Everyday families are struggling. The cost of everything is increasing. People can't pay their hydro bills. They can't pay their rent. They're having a hard time making ends meet. Food prices are going up. And all this government can do is stick the finger in the eye of the hardest working, lowest income workers in this province. It is dragging our province backwards. It is shameful.
The freezing of the minimum wage is part of legislation tabled by the Ford government today called the Making Ontario Open for Business Act. It does away with much of Bill 148. The 2 paid sick days that all Ontarians were guaranteed are gone, and unpaid leave days have been reduced from 10 to 8.
They will be unpaid days, which lines up with the other provinces in Canada. And a medical note will be necessary if asked by the employer. Again, reducing burden for businesses and creating jobs.
The government says the sick days and the higher minimum wage has led to job losses, though Ontario's unemployment rate is at the lowest in decades.
Can you name any businesses that shut down operations and moved south of the border because of Bill 148?
I don't want to name, but we do have examples. Jim, I don't know if you want to answer that question.
Well, not by name.
Jeff Wilson, a consultant to the hospitality industry, thinks many businesses may keep some of the Bill 148 provisions.
We have a bit of a labor crisis, quite honestly, across Canada, and in particular in food service, we have challenges getting talented culinary people as well. So I think each operator is going to have to evaluate where they're at.
Business groups have long called on the government to get rid of Bill 148. It said it cost them a lot of money, but workers' rights groups said it was the only way for employees to keep up with the rising cost of living. In Queen's Park, Richard Southern, City News.
So there you can see some of the arguments about why. But the hospitality business group pointed out that when even though there is a minimum wage, if an employer is having trouble finding people, they may go a little bit above the minimum wage in order to retain their employees. Unfortunately, what I think happened overall is it did lead to people struggling to pay a lot of their necessities. So, well, what does a 15-hour minimum wage mean? Well, 40 hours a week, $600. Um, you know, 4.5 weeks per month, $26 or $2,600 a month, $31,000 a year. Now, this is the average wage in Canada is $58,000. So it's quite a bit below that average level. Well, okay. Well, what does that buy? Here's the cost of living in Toronto. So those who rent, who take public transit, spend $3,500 a month or $42,000 annually. You can see that there's an issue here, right? They're not even at $15 an hour. They're going to be struggling. So they're going to be working multiple jobs. There's going to be multiple families living together. Renters who drive, 46,000. If someone happens to own a home, it's 64,000 to live in the city of Toronto. So that's with public transit, or 68,000 if you maintain your own car. So even the average person working an average hourly wage job in Canada is not going to be able to afford a home in Toronto. So this cost of living issue is something to consider. Like, how can the city be livable if people cannot afford to live there? And I think you might have noticed in the COVID-19 issue in long-term care homes, there were personal support workers who, because of the low wages, were working in many homes in order multiple jobs to make ends meet, and it actually led to the spread of COVID-19. So some of these things, there's a bit of a penny wise, pound foolish expression. Sure, a business might have saved a few dollars, but then there were significant additional expense caused by the people who were struggling working multiple jobs, or eliminating the sick days, and people coming to work with possible COVID-19 symptoms because they didn't want to lose the paycheck again. It might have been short-sighted, but look into the issue and read it yourself. So that reporter asked the government, well, has anyone left Canada because of high minimum wages? And that is a concern with international businesses, that companies will seek out the lowest production costs possible, and as a result, they'll go to countries where there's a low minimum wage. The low minimum wage in Mexico, which is part of NAFTA, is about 1/5 of what it is in Ontario. So sometimes in countries like Canada and the US, they are a bit more productive, a little bit more training, a little better use of technology, but it's definitely nearly impossible to be 5 times as productive. And even as companies go to these other countries, because of the low wages, they find that wages keep climbing up and interfering with profits. So here's Ford has built many plants close to the U.S.-Mexico border to take advantage of the low wages, but here's what they have to deal with.
Well, Ford says it's speeding up plans to have fully driverless cars on the roads within 5 years. So the question is, where will those cars be built? Will the road to innovation lead Ford south of the border? Jeff Block has details.
Lauren and Nicole, I come to you from Ford's oldest continuously operating assembly plant here in Chicago. Assembly plants like this in the U.S., Ford, the estimate is, pays about $60 an hour in wages and benefits per employee. That new plant they're planning to build down in Mexico, they think that'll be closer to $8. But not so fast. Take a look at some of these numbers. The wage increases in Mexico since the year 2000, up 128%. That's the trend. And if you look at the last 10 years, it bears that out. Wage growth in Mexico compared to the U.S., double in Mexico what it is in the U.S. Now, admittedly, still wages in Mexico far lower. They pale in comparison to wages here in the U.S., but we're starting to see now companies in Mexico have difficulty actually attracting enough workers and keeping them on the job because wages are going up. They're getting protests about low wages, and they're being forced to increase the wages. So the savings may not be there. And some economists say they think actually, when it comes down to it in the future, companies will have trouble attracting enough Mexican workers to populate all the plants down there. The various auto companies now planning to invest about $15 billion in new auto plants in Mexico, either new or expansion of current plants. So maybe when it comes down to that wall, maybe you don't need to build it after all. Maybe the labor situation kind of balances out on both sides of the border. But if you're going to build the wall, at least put some doors in it so the Mexican immigrants can get back to Mexico where they might actually find a better job. Lauren, Nicole, back to you.
Oh, Jeff Black.
All right, a little bit of opinion there, but just to show you a bit of an update, normally we say, okay, well, yes, they do go to Mexico because of the $2 and 75 cent minimum wage, but there's so many companies operating down there that might not be the case any longer. But you can see there was quite a difference between the wage in the U.S., which is even a little less than the wage in Canada, and the wage in Mexico. So that's why companies might consider it, although the government couldn't really provide any evidence. So how does Canada's minimum wage? So this is in U.S. dollars. So obviously the money gets, the 14.25 gets converted to the U.S. rate. So here's the top 35 organized countries. So Australia, Luxembourg, France, they have the highest minimum wage. Canada's in the middle. The U.S. is about 7.25. And so you can see that Canada's minimum wage is kind of quite in the middle of all these industrialized countries. But if you want to find out more, you can go to stats.oecd.org. It has a real minimum wage where it takes the minimum wage and figures out how a basket of necessities, how much does it buy, and compares different countries. And you can see how Canada compares to other countries, and you can also maybe look at wealth per person, like GDP per capita or educational attainment, and see how Canada compares to others. If you wanted to put that 14.25 an hour into context, the OECD website has excellent stats. And then as yourself, this is a screencast, so you're watching it independently, but just think about how would you, what side of the argument would you take? Should there be a minimum wage or not? And what would be the number one reason you would use as your support if you had to